I'm Thom Dennis, and I'm the CEO of Serenity and Leadership. We're a premier conflict resolution, culture integration, and change specialist, and we help businesses overcome challenges to achieve successful, lasting outcomes whilst always putting their people at the heart of the business. Today, I'd like to welcome Raggi Kotak to this podcast. Raggi is the founder and director of JEDI Consultancy and has been a human rights barrister for more than 20 years. Much of her work has been challenging issues of racism, oppression, and gender violence through law, social action, and policy. Raggi's set to be our guest speaker at our next dialogue on the 21st of October, and I'm delighted that she'll be talking to us about her experience about challenging racism. Raggi, welcome.
Thank you, Thom. Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, we're really excited to learn more about you.
Great.
So the first thing I'm really intrigued to know, Raggi, is what influenced you to become a human rights barrister and activist?
I wish I had this really fantastic story I always wanted to fight for justice. But I think as a child, there was a TV show called LA Law. I don't know if you remember that. Do you remember LA Law? And I used to watch it and I used to love it. I used to get really excited. And I always thought, I could do that. I can be a lawyer. And that's what happened. Basically, I went and studied business. And after my degree, it was a choice of going to do an MA in economics or converting onto law. And I'm very glad that I converted onto law. I then stepped into law school. I started volunteering places. I volunteered at a law centre. I volunteered at the Terence Higgins Trust, which is a HIV charity. And they had a really brilliant legal department. And the coolest solicitor in the legal department was the immigration solicitor. And she would help me work on her. She would let me help her work on her cases. And I loved it. I always worked with asylum seekers. I've always worked with asylum seekers. And it's just such incredible work, so worthwhile, so fascinating. And that was it. I was hooked. I was a human rights lawyer.
Brilliant. So have you personally faced racism?
Oh gosh, yes. Most people, growing up in the UK that look like me, particularly of a certain generation, have definitely faced racism. So I was born in 1968, right? And that was the year Enoch Powell, who was an MP.
The Rivers of Blood.
Yes, exactly. The Rivers of Blood speech, right? And that led to a massive increase in racism. So by the time I was at primary school, you couldn't go to the end of the road without someone calling you the P word, right? During, as I was in secondary school, people were chasing me, people were making comments. I grew up in a very white area of North London, so there weren't many of us. So I was quite isolated. And in those days, racism was absolutely rife. So from an early age, I was, and you don't really know how to, you don't really know where to place it because you don't really understand it, particularly when you're a child, particularly when you're in an environment where you don't really have many other people that look like you around you that can explain what's happening and why it's happening. You just don't really understand. And I think I've only really made sense of it as an adult. Now I can look back and think, wow, did those things happen? So yeah, particularly in those early days, I really experienced racism. And of course, through my life, through my adult life, through my career, at various stages, at different levels, of course, racism is something that's really prevalent for those of us who are of color.
I have to ask you, that government-sponsored report, I can't remember the name of it now.
The Sewell Report.
Yes, which was, he's a man of color. I haven't read it all, but I've read a bit of it, and it seems like it's been written in fairyland. What's your impression of it?
Chuck it in the bin. I mean, it's appalling, right? And it's been absolutely criticized and destroyed by everybody, academics, race activists. The UN came out against it. I think Tony Sewell originally stood by the report and said that he'd written it himself. He then, after he was so heavily criticized, said that he had experienced pressure from the Cabinet Office, who are the ones that commissioned the report. But it doesn't tie in with anything that's come before or has come after. There's been numerous reports from the state. There's been investigations, the Lamy Review, the Angelini Review, right from Macpherson 20 years ago. But in November 2020, the Joint Committee of Human Rights wrote a really damning report about Black people and the impact on Black people, where they were really critical about state procedures and practices and the systemic issues that were impacting Black people. And then the Tony Sewell report comes out in March, which basically says that, you know, racism is no longer an issue. If people experience racism, it's really their own fault. They should be doing more to help them rise out of racism. And then post that, there's been rhetoric internationally, nationally, that is saying something completely different. So, I mean, it's, you know, it's not really worth your attention, to be honest. It doesn't really make sense. I don't really know what they were thinking, what the pressure was, but it's I don't know anybody who has had said one good thing about it, and it's not evidence-based. It's not based on evidence. There's these sweeping kind of suggestions which aren't based on fact. So yeah, it's pretty poor.
So we can we can accept that systemic racism does exist, and I think that's a good starting point, as opposed to sort of having a discussion as to whether it does or not.
The way you tell if systemic racism is an issue is by looking at the data, right? And if you look at the data on a whole range of issues, employment, criminal justice system, housing, if you look at all of this, you can see disproportionate outcomes for those that are racialized as, say, brown or Black. But COVID-19 was a really obvious example. The first 10 doctors to die, I think, were Asian. The percentages of those of color who died from COVID was so much higher than white communities that it's stark. Yes. I think there was, I read something, it was a report by Doctors Unite, it's the Union for Doctors, and they very clearly named the racism that was prevalent that led to these outcomes.
Yeah, it's very sad.
Yeah, it's really sad.
What has your overall experience been working in law as a woman of color? What kind of barriers have you faced and challenges?
It's such an interesting question, because I was in an open meeting last night with about 100 lawyers talking about this. So it's changed a lot. One, because as I've become more senior, I have more power, and people wouldn't dare to say the same things that they would dare to say to you when you're junior. Also, society has changed. The more blatant forms of racism have become more hidden with time. Of course, we've seen over the last few years, racism massively rise up nationally and internationally with, governments that are actively racist across the world, that are implementing policies that are named to be racist. So as the world changes, it changes for people like me in our professions. But at an early stage, it was a lot more difficult. And listening to some of these more junior lawyers yesterday, they are still experiencing it quite clearly. And the more senior lawyers, it happens, but it's more subtle often. But yeah, I mean, it's, being a barrister, law is such a privileged profession, particularly the bar, right, where barristers are. And it's a profession where it's groups of self-employed people in organizations. We don't have human resources. We don't have that much supervision, and people kind of say and do what they want to a certain extent. It's changing. They're talking about more regulation, but yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem. And of course, right, that, we're the people that become the judges, right? And then when you look at the figures, say from the Lamy report of, the racism in the criminal justice system, all of these things are connected.
Yeah, yeah. And if you can't turn to the law, what options have you got?
Absolutely, absolutely. And some people think, it's not like that here in the UK. It's just in the US that things are really difficult. Listening to, after the murder of George Floyd, people are much more accepting that, that system, from the police to the court system, creates a real disproportionate outcome. But we have a lot of examples here in the UK as well. Racism is an issue that, if you're of privilege, if you're white, you might not notice it because you don't need to. But if you're racialized, I was in a room, I was in different meeting rooms last night, and I was in a room at the end with 30, 40 people. About 80% of them were racialized. Some of them were Silks. Silk is a very senior barrister. And the stories that were coming out from everyone across the board were really outrageous. It's great that we're now talking about it. We used to not speak about it. It was like the big secret, right? Everybody experienced it, but nobody talked about it. So it's really wonderful that we're able to talk about it, and we're able to talk about it here. People are talking about it across law, in business, in educational establishments, in schools. I'm getting contacted across the board. Everybody is now trying to get to grips with the racism that they experience. And that's really wonderful. And we need to make sure that we continue and bring change.
I was very struck in our last dialogue, which you were at.
Yes.
When G used this example, I can't quote him as fluently as he said it, but
sure.
all the different racialized terms were being compared against white.
Yes.
And it was very stark. And then, of course, gay as against straight. So we live in a society where there are these defaults. White is the default.
That's exactly
straight
right.
is the default.
Absolutely.
In many respects, male is the default.
Absolutely.
And when you sit in those, and obviously I occupy all of those. The amount of work that I find myself having to do to take myself out, and in NLP terms, take a third position and look at where I sit in all this system.
It's
hard. A lot of effort.
It's a lot of effort, and it's super important, because as hard as it is for you, it's much harder for those that are out of those privileged positions and that are experiencing that marginalization, right? It's really hard for you now because it's new, right? For us, we've been experiencing this, and we've been navigating these fields all our lives, right? So whenever we learn to do anything new, it's a little clunky, right? It's uncomfortable, it's clunky, but asking you this, as you've been working on these issues, has it become easier or harder?
Well, I think the more aware you become, the harder it becomes, because you have to put more effort in. It's very easy to live in blissful ignorance.
Yeah, exactly. But you're the only one that's ignorant. Everybody around you that's not living in that privilege is living with the impact of that privilege. Yeah. Right? Because by definition, if somebody's privileged, somebody else is marginalized. And if somebody's marginalized, somebody's privileged, right? So these things work together. And if only part of that circle, part of that group is aware of what's going on, and the privileged part is always centralized and seen as the default, and everything is seen as a comparison to the default. You know, where's the justice in that, right? And where's the fun, right? That's not humanity. That's not, yeah, who wants to live like that? It's not much fun.
No.
I hope for more.
Yeah. Raggi, you've been shortlisted for the Diversity Champion at the Diversity Legal Awards.
Makes me shy.
You know, congratulations for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, what are you most proud of to have worked on in that context?
The award, I think I am proud, actually. You know, there's been times before where I've been up for awards or people have wanted to nominate me for awards, and I've just felt shy and embarrassed, right? But for this one, I really am delighted, partly because the awards are by the Black Solicitors Network. So they're an organization that's been set up to create a space to foster more inclusion in law. And, you know, being recognized as in the shortlist for the Diversity Champion means a lot. And what that is about, that's about the work that I'm doing in the field of law around mostly challenging racism. You know, I'm working with a lot of lawyers. I'm on an advisory committee at the BSB. The BSB, the Bar Standards Board, are our regulatory authority. So I'm all over the place doing stuff around challenging oppression, and yeah, it's really nice to have that recognised. And it's really nice because the other people that have also been shortlisted are amazing. So it's really nice to I mean, I don't know if I'm going to get the award. The finalists are announced in November.
Right.
So
yes.
Who knows?
Well, we're rooting for you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
So you're our speaker for our October event on racism. We've said racism in the workplace, but I think it's more interesting that we look at your experience of racism and your experience of can I say fighting for racial justice?
Yes, perfect.
And that dialogue's on the 21st of October. So what can we expect to hear from you then? Let's have a little well, not a taster, but a warmer for people who might be watching this.
I think people are really scared to talk about race. I'm really challenged to look at racism. We all freeze. It's not something that we're very used to talking about. And I think what I want to do is help create an environment where we can just talk about it and it's okay. It's not about shaming anyone. It's not about making anyone feel bad. It's about showing people how we're all socialized and conditioned in the dynamics of racism, wherever we sit around that, right? Racism comes externally as dominance. It comes internally as oppression. And we're all part of the problem and we're all impacted. So just creating a space where we can just look at that a little bit and look at where that conditioning comes from and, you know, start to unpick it a bit so people are less frightened of working on issues of race, of having those dialogues, and they're willing to show up more and do the work. Right? You know, without judgment, without shaming people, with compassion, yeah, we can bring change. It's not about attacking each other. It's not about, you know, you're more privileged than me. You've had more opportunities. You know, I'm also privileged. I'm a barrister, right? You know, we all hold power in different ways. Racism is very much about power, and we hold power in different ways. And how can we come together in a really diverse group? Your dialogues, it's really interesting. There's such a diverse group of people that come, that there's so much rich learning for everybody in the room. Yeah. So it's about creating that space where we can just start to dialogue, start to talk about it, and it to be okay.
Yeah.
To be safe enough.
So to wrap things up, what are your top 3 ways for how business leaders can become change makers to tackle racism, what would you advise?
I'd say, first of all, be willing to show up, right? You may not recognize, you may not even believe that there's racism in your organization, but be willing to show up and look and check and show up and do the work, right? Show up and do the work, because you may not believe that there's racism in your organization, but I guarantee those that look like me believe that there's racism in your organization, because racism is everywhere,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I'd say the second thing is start with an audit. Yeah, start with an audit, because if you don't actually know what's there and where it is, how are you going to challenge it? So look at your data, look at, you know, who's coming in, who's staying, who's leaving, what positions people are in. Talk to people, have maybe focus groups, have some one-to-ones. The third thing is put a budget behind it. All right, you need to put a budget behind it. If you're not going to put a budget behind it, the work is not going to get done. And it's really important to get external people in to do some of this work. If you don't get an external person doing the audit, then people are not going to speak their truth. Yeah. You need to, and it's also what happens often is we have an expectation that people who are racialized do the work because they apparently have the expertise, but that creates such an unnecessary emotional burden on people. It's quite exhausting for some people. I don't feel exhausted because this is what I do for a living, right? And I love it. But for others in a workplace, you know, that's just a recipe for disaster, to exhaust your staff, to expect an unnecessary amount of work from them. So I would say,
yeah. It's such an easy trap to fall into, that you can say, oh, well, they're colored, they must understand, so we'll ask them to chair the committee or take a lead on it, as opposed to just. And I remember Joanne on our podcast with her, she was saying, just because you're trans doesn't mean to say you're an expert in trans.
Yeah, absolutely. You know,
it's this, we so want to be in binary thinking and be simplistic. So, okay, absolutely, that's a black person, they can do it, as opposed to taking the responsibility ourselves and learning and seeing somebody in such a way that we honor them. It's very difficult because it's so, in some respects, it's so difficult not to see people as different. And again, we talked about that yesterday, didn't we? We have this sort of default where difference is something to shun.
I think we are different, right? We're all different, right? We're all unique.
Yes, but it needs to be beautiful, or seen as beautiful, as opposed to a threat.
And we're, you know, if you put me in a group of other Asian women, we're all unique and we're all very different as well, right? It's not just me and you being Asian and white, right? There's so much difference. And I kind of think, you know, racism shows up as trauma in the system. And some people may want to work on these issues, like I choose to work on it, right? But other people, it can be really traumatic and really distressing because they're dealing with, you know, hate. They're dealing with issues that are about disliking them, and it's all just about skin color. You know, genetically, there's no difference between us. It's all just geography, that we have more melanin in our skin. That's what separates us. So it feels very painful for some people to be dealing with it.
Exactly.
And it shouldn't be expected.
It's unfair. So Raggi, thank you. It's been lovely talking to you. We could go on, but you know, we ought to stop, really. So I really look forward to seeing you on the next dialogue when you're leading the talk. And down below, you'll see the description and a link to the Eventbrite site to get tickets. And 50% of the proceeds will go to charity. Raggi's going to offer great perspectives on racism and how it affects us today, it's not one to miss. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Thom. Bye.